Okay, here we go.
Ah,
So, um, all right. So it's been a while since we had a class, and I'm not gonna back up to get us sort of up to speed about where we are. But essentially, what the Gemara is pondering and puzzling over right now is the question of why do we have two dips? Why do we dip twice? Right? I mean, on all other nights, we do not dip even once. Why on this night do we dip twice? And the question is, why indeed do we dip twice? Okay. And it may not be exactly clear. I mean, first of all, it's not exactly clear because why do we dip twice? I mean, why do we dip twice? Because we're following the Haggadah, and the Haggadah tells us to dip twice, right? But why does the Haggadah tell us to dip twice? And this is puzzling because, especially in, um, I mean, we dip, right? So, what is the dipping? We dip the karpas, which is usually parsley, but it could be any cooked vegetable. I mean, today in Israel, it's usually potatoes, but in Mishnaic or Amoraic times, it certainly wasn't potatoes, right? How do we know it wasn't potatoes?
they didn't have potatoes.
They didn't have potatoes, right? Potatoes are a quote unquote new world vegetable, right?
Yes.
So they didn't have potatoes, right? And so it's entirely possible that they were using lettuce for both dippings, okay? Because lettuce, especially if you're talking romaine, which was probably the form of lettuce that they had, romaine is bitter, especially the stalks. And they also didn't have horseradish, okay? Because I'm not sure that horseradish is per se a new world veg. I don't know actually, but um, but the use of horseradish as bitter herbs came in Russia and Poland when it's still pretty cold around Pesach, and they're not going to have a lot of like fresh leafy greens available. So that it is possible that both dippings were done with romaine lettuce. Okay, in which case you've got a problem because you're saying two blessings, two brachot on one vegetable, okay, which it seems problematic. So they're making up the possibility that maybe the second dipping was because when you did the first dipping, you didn't have kavanah, you didn't have intentionality. And then the question is, do you have to have intention? Do you have to intend to fulfill the mitzvah when you're doing the action which fulfills the mitzvah, or is doing the action enough? Okay. And then they say, well, maybe doing the action isn't enough, and he didn't have kavanah. But then they kind of reject that argument, and that's where we come in. Okay. Perhaps Rabbi Yosei maintains that mitzvot do not require intent. Mitzvot ein srichot kavanah. And the second dipping is that there should be a conspicuous distinction for the children, right? In other words, now this only really makes sense with the original formulation of this statement in the Haggadah, which, because in the original statement of the Haggadah, in the Mishnaic form, it doesn't say, on all other nights we do not even dip once. Why on this night do we dip twice? Right? Because that's not a distinction for the kids, right? I mean, if we don't even dip once, oh, so the kids are not going to notice that something is different if we dip once, but they'll notice something different if we dip twice. That doesn't make any sense, right? Even one time they would notice, right? But what is the original formula in the Mishnah? All right, don't blame me if you don't remember, because this was a long time ago that we covered it. But in the original formula in the Mishnah, it says, on all other nights we dip once. Why on this night do we dip twice? Okay, and if that's the formula, then yeah, indeed, if you want the kids to notice something odd, then you really need a second dipping, because the first dipping is not odd, it's normal, it's what they do every night. Okay, so the second dipping is simply for the kids to notice something is unusual, and they'll ask, hey, why the second dipping? And you'll explain to them about, how our ancestors' lives were bitter in Egypt and God freed them and all of that. Okay, but the Gemara says, if so, why does Rabbi Yosei use the term mitzvah, right? Because, and I mean, that's all the Gemara itself says, but our commentary here says there's no mitzvah from the Torah to provide a distinction to stimulate the curiosity of the young ones. The mitzvah is to eat bitter herbs. Okay, in other words, the Gemara's problem is if you say we have to do it for the sake of doing something distinctive so that the kids will notice and ask questions, right? That's fine, but don't call it a mitzvah, right? In other words, to quote something that Mike said weeks ago, it's a tool to accomplish the purpose, right? It's a tool to accomplish the purpose, right? And there's not per se a mitzvah to dip twice so that the kids will notice and ask questions, right? There's a mitzvah to provoke the curiosity of the children, maybe, right? The higadata levincha bayom hahu, right? You shall tell higid haggadah, you shall tell your son on that day. So there's arguably a mitzvah to provoke the curiosity of the children so that they'll ask questions. But the methodology of how you do that, certainly, there's nowhere in the Torah where it says you should dip a second time to provoke the curiosity of your kids, right? It doesn't say that, right? Dee, I notice you're kind of hesitantly sticking up your hand. So
I'm uncomfortable in position, but I will just throw this out a little bit earlier. The idea of doing something twice because somebody may not have had the right intent the first time, it seems to me that's not a magical cure for not having the right intent at any time.
Well, I mean, but right, it's not that it's a magical cure, but you've fixed the problem, right? I've done the act, but I didn't have the right intention. So the act doesn't count. So now I do the act a second time with the right intention, and it does count.
Hopefully, that's what I'm saying.
Well, no, but I mean, the presumption is,
yeah,
the presumption is that it does because it's a mitzvah, right? I mean, that's the presumption. Yeah, Mike.
So I'm more taken with the Gemara saying that the Rava would have beets and rice.
We're not there yet. We're not there yet.
Oh, all right.
No, we're not there yet. But yes,
Sephardic.
right?
Sephardic.
We're not there yet. Okay. But now we'll go on. Now we'll go on to that. Okay. So, right. So you have to have two cooked dishes, right? The Mishnah says after you have the two dippings, you have two cooked dishes. What are these two cooked dishes? Rav Huna said beets and rice. Okay. Now, Mike, why does this intrigue you?
Well, because we, that's the royal we, have always considered rice to be, well, now we call it kitniot and we say it's okay. But for generations, we were taught not to eat rice on Passover. And here it is in the Gemara, and specifically saying we're supposed to eat rice.
Correct. Right, D.
In my upbringing and sharing with my Sephardic friends and rabbi, the answer that I was given was it's the difference between Ashkenaz and Sephard. I'm not talking about when Kinyot came about, because that's what was available. That it's a geographical issue of crops that were grown or were not grown based on that's what people ate.
I mean, you're right that in Israel, I was once at a Seder with the Israeli whatever embassy, and they served rice.
Right.
And I was young and stupid, and so Bobby and I thought that I guess it's okay to have rice. So for several years after that, we had rice because we were just taught by the Israelis it's okay. But we were raised that
Right.
you don't do that.
Me
And
too.
it took another bunch of years before the conservative movement came out and said kitnios is okay. And if it was so, if it was just Ashkenaz and Sephard, we Ashkenazim do not. How do I say this? So here's the Gemara saying it's okay. I don't believe it would be very easy to find another place in the Gemara where Ashkenazim simply ignore it or say, no, you can't do that because of whatever, whether it's geography or availability or whatnot, that we might substitute something that makes sense locally, but we would never I don't think we would ever turn our back on positively on something the Gemara says. This is a pretty clear statement.
But most of us, well, I don't have the right to say most, but I will anyhow. My opinion is that most of us, especially if we are not deeply learned, go by what we have been taught and how we have grown up and what our families
Right.
did. And in many cases, it's, how can I explain this? And I don't mean to sound didactic about it, but it's like arguing with somebody. If you don't know the text or you didn't even see or read this, you would think that, this is absurd. My parents didn't do this. My grandparents didn't do this, and I'm not going to do this.
Right.
And my experience, Mike, was similar to yours in that I was dating somebody. We had kind of grown up together. Our families knew each other. I never even knew the difference between Ashkenaz and Sephard. We were just all one Jewish community.
Right.
But I was invited to their second Seder. And I went, and they had chicken soup. Instead of matzo balls, they had rice.
Yeah.
And I loved his parents dearly, and I did not want to insult them. On the other hand, I didn't want to violate family tradition. So I simply ate the soup, and my boyfriend's mother picked up on it right away. And she said, sweetheart, let me tell you the difference between Ashkenaz and Sephard. And all she did was put it in terms of food.
Right. All right. So let me unpack this a little bit.
All right.
Okay. So first of all, I mean, you guys are both a bit older than I am and come from
Thank you a bit.
from a more traditional background than I was raised with. But I would say, and this is typical of Jews of your generation, is that you were raised in homes which were observant but not necessarily particularly knowledgeable, right? And so you probably were never taught the difference between chametz and kitniyot.
Right,
It was all under the rubric of things that are not
Right.
kosher for Passover.
right,
Correct.
But if you went to your rabbi would explain to you that there is a difference between chametz and kitniyot, and that, for example, you don't sell your kitniyot before Pesach. You can have kitniyot in your house. You can buy kitniyot during Pesach. You just can't eat them.
Right.
If you go to a Sephardic home and they serve you kitniyot, push the kitniyot away to the side and eat everything else, and that's perfectly fine. Okay. Now, the second thing is that this text predates the split between Sfaradim and Ashkenazim.
Ah,
Okay, it predates that split. Secondarily, and this is really interesting, to the extent that there is a difference between the Bavli and the Yerushalmi, okay, the Bavli practice became the Ashkenazi practice. And the Yerushalmi practice became, so this would actually represent what ultimately became Ashkenazi. Okay, this whole thing of kitniyot is much, much later.
right,
All right, 500 years later at a minimum, maybe even more than that. Okay, and clearly, I mean, to an extent it is, I mean, in other words, tell somebody in Poland or Lithuania or Hungary or Romania or Germany, go without rice for 8 days. I go without rice 365 days anyway, not a big deal, right? Tell somebody in
I know,
Eretz Yisrael or
I know,
Morocco, Egypt, go without rice for 8 days. It's a little bit bigger of a deal, right? I mean, it doesn't mean, look, obviously, we tell everybody go without wheat, go without barley, go without oats, go without rye for 8 days. So we can say rice too, but it's not, I mean, the point is that it's not that big a deal. Okay. But so clearly, right, the Gemara explicitly says beets and rice, and Rava would seek beets and rice for his meal on Pesach because this ruling came from Rav Huna's mouth. In other words, right, like you say, we do what our parents did. Right, well, Rava wants to do what Rav Huna did, even though Rava is smart enough, right, and learned enough. He knows that beets and rice, when Rav Huna says, oh, beets and rice, he's not saying it has to be beets and rice. He's giving an example. Could be beets and rice, right? But Rava wants to have beets and rice because that's what his teacher had, right? Now, let's go on to the next paragraph, okay? Because now this, I'm going to have to unpack this because it's, there's background that you don't know. So Rav Ashi said, learn from this, incidentally, that there is no one who is concerned about that statement of Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri, because there's a baraita, Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri says rice is a type of grain in all regards. Rice is, as far as Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri is concerned, rice is grain. Okay, so he's not saying rice is kitnio. He's saying rice is grain. And if rice is grain, if you eat it leavened on Pesach, correct. It's chametz. You've eaten chametz. If you eat rice that has been in contact with water for 18 minutes, it's chametz. Correct. Your soul is cut off from the Jewish people, but also you can make rice matzah and fulfill the mitzvah, right? Rice matzah. Now, nobody holds that, right? Literally nobody holds that way, right? I mean, there's a difference. Sure, Ashkenazim hold that rice is kitniot, and therefore we don't eat it, right? But I mean, this is the thing. I mean, chametz and matzah are mirror images of each other, right? I mean, the only things that can be made into matzah, right, are things that can become chametz, right? I mean, when people say, they sell these like gluten-free matzah style squares, right, that are made of like tapioca or something, okay? You cannot fulfill the mitzvah of eating matzah with those, okay? They're not matzah because tapioca can't become chametz. And if it can't become chametz, it's not matzah. Right now, depending on how gluten-free you need to be, I think oats, although they're grain and can become chametz or matzah, they don't have gluten. So for some people, you can certainly, if oat matzah is safe for you, you can fulfill your obligation, right? If even the tiniest bit of gluten is going to make you violently ill, then you're exempt from the mitzvah to eat matzah, in which case go ahead and eat the tapioca thing, right? But if gluten simply causes you a little bit of discomfort, or your cousin down the block told you that her rabbi or her internist said blah blah, no, I mean, eat it, but you're not fulfilling the mitzvah. You're not fulfilling the mitzvah. Okay, so what Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri here is what's known as a dat yachid. A dat yachid means he's the only one who holds this way. But Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri holds that rice is grain, and therefore rice can become chametz, and rice can be made into matzah, which fulfills the obligation to eat matzah. Okay, now this was something that I didn't know until I studied this chapter of the Gemara. But it's interesting because when I was in rabbinical school, okay, I was in rabbinical school at the time that the Reform movement passed what's known as patrilineal descent, right? You're familiar with that. That says a child with a Jewish father and a non-Jewish mother can be considered a Jew if they're raised as a Jew, and da-da-da-da-da, right? Even though the halacha says the opposite. And in the debate about this patrilineal principle, one of those who favored it quoted Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri, who held that a child with a Jewish father and a non-Jewish mother was nevertheless Jewish. And then somebody else pointed out that Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri, so he's a dat yachid now, as far as I know, for three things. Rice is grain, which means it can become hametz or it can be made into matzah. The son of a Jewish father and a non-Jewish mother is a Jew. And the third thing that he's a dat yachid for is that fish, in order to be kosher, requires shchita. You have to shchita, kosher slaughter. Okay, you can't just take them out of the water and let them die. You have to bring your live fish to a shochet and have the shochet shech the fish. Okay, which
Fish should be dead by the time you get to a shochet.
not if you bring it in water.
We did that. I did that actually with my nephews, caught fish in Montgomery Village Lake 20 years ago. They were little boys. We put them in a bucket. This is not looking for a sheket, but we carried them to Giant to find out what kind of fish they were, because we kept kosher and we had to be careful about not bringing them home.
Right.
But they were dead by the time we got them home.
Okay, but we don't hold that way. We don't hold that you need to bring your fish to a shochet. You can just, take them out of the water and that's fine.
But back up for a quick second. On the paternal lineage issue, that is only acceptable today by Reform?
Reform and Reconstructionist.
Okay, but not us.
Not us.
Still by the mother, okay.
Yeah. Now, of course, we will try to facilitate conversion as easily and painlessly as possible for the child of a Jewish father and a non-Jewish mother who's going to be raised in one of our congregations. Right. But there has to be a conversion.
But what about at birth? For example, if it's a boy, can you have a bris and can the baby be converted at birth?
Well, you not only can you have a bris, you should have a bris.
Right.
But you should have.
But male.
Well, it can't be converted at birth because it can't be brought to a mikveh at birth. Okay. But they can't. But in the case of a boy, you should have a bris. The only difference is because it's not Jewish and therefore it's not. In other words, you can't have such a bris on Shabbos. Okay, it is called milah l'shem giur. Okay, circumcision for purpose of conversion. And obviously it's preferable to do it as a milah l'shem giur than to, wait until later. Right. Then you'd have to do a hatafat dam or an actual circumcision. Okay. So let's go on to the next section. Hizkiah says, now we're talking about what are the two
meals, cooked meals.
What are the two cooked foods? And Hizkiah says it could be a fish, shechted or not, I'm not sure, right? But a fish and the egg that's cooked on top of it. Apparently this is something that they did.
Ugh.
But Rav Yosef says it has to be two types of meat, one as a remembrance of the Paschal lamb and one as a remembrance of the Hagigah, of the Hag, the festival offering. Okay, and Ravina says it could be a bone, the meat on a bone, and the gravy in which it was cooked, but it has to do two different things. Now, this business of, go back to what Rav Yosef says, echad zecher lepesach v'echad zecher l'chagigah, right? So you have to have two different types of meat one to recall the Paschal lamb and one to recall the festival offering. Okay, now today I'm sure that there are plenty of people who in a way fulfill this, even though they don't know they're fulfilling it, by having, turkey and brisket, right? Or chicken and brisket, right? But there is something on the Seder plate that most people don't know, but we actually fulfill this concept of Zecher LePesach and Zecher LeChagigah on the Seder plate. Okay? What is the Zecher LePesach on the Seder plate?
The shank bone?
The shank bone.
Right.
Right? What is the Zecher LeChagigah?
The egg.
The egg. Exactly. Exactly. I didn't think anybody would know that.
Well,
So,
I mean, the shank bone that's on the Seder plate, nobody's going to eat, but symbolically, there's the two foods right there.
right. That's symbolically, that's exactly right. The egg symbolizes
Like,
the Hagigah, the festival, which is why it's roasted. Why it's roasted, because both the Paschal sacrifice and the festival sacrifice were roasted. So it's really the roasticity that is a remembrance or a reminder of the festival offering. Okay. Now I have the custom, this is the first year that I didn't do it in a long time, of putting the egg in the oven and forgetting about it, so that it's not merely
really
roasted,
roasted.
it's incinerated.
Oh my God. Question.
But this year, for the first time, I didn't do that. Yes, Dee.
I may have something that I've been taught mixed up with something else, but I thought because we don't have the temple, that we can't have the Paschal lamb. And therefore, you don't have something like lamb chops or rack of lamb or anything that has lamb. Did I mix that up, or am I right?
No, not at all. All right, so here's the role of custom, right? And you've both heard me say, not necessarily specifically about this particular question, but in general, you've heard me say there are things we do because they did them in the temple, and there are things we don't do because they did them in the temple, right? So Ashkenazi practice is not to eat lamb to remind us of the fact that the temple is destroyed and we don't have a Paschal lamb.
So we have brisket or some such.
We have brisket or turkey or whatever.
Right. Okay.
Right? Sephardic practice is to have lamb to remind us of the Paschal lamb. Okay, now in both cases, these are customs and not law. Okay, and I suspect that even if you went to a Chabad rabbi and said, is it allowed to have lamb for the Seder? He would say, well, it's not our custom, and one really should respect your ancestral customs, and therefore I very much don't recommend it. And then if you say, yeah, Rabbi, but I didn't ask you if you recommended it, I asked you if it was forbidden, he would say, well, I can't actually say it's forbidden, but it's not our practice and it really shouldn't be done.
Everything
and I would, by the way, say the same thing, but
everything that you're discussing reminds me of something that my father told me years and years and years and years ago. The amount of divorce among Jews was very low. And he said one of the biggest reasons for Jewish divorce was not adultery. It was that the husband and the wife could not reconcile that the wife cooked like the husband's mother.
Uh-huh.
And very often it came as a combination of two things. Her mother didn't do it the way his mother did it, or
Right.
geography, whether Sephardic or, and of course, years ago, it was horrible if a Sephardi and an Ashkenazi got together. So,
Oh, forget that. I mean, there's all this research in Jewish culinary anthropology on the gefilte fish line.
yep.
Okay.
Yep.
Is gefilte fish sweet or savory?
Yep. Or
Is
pepper.
kugel sweet or savory?
Right.
Matzah brei sweet or savory? Right? And here we're talking all about Ashkenazi foods, right? But even so, different communities made them differently, sweet or savory, right? I mean, to me, sweet gefilte fish and sweet kugel are disgusting, right? Matzah brei, I could eat either way. I mean, because it depends whether you like wanting something sweet or like if it's a dessert or a meal. But you know, but that's because my family is Lithuanian and we ate these things savory, not sweet. But Hungarians ate them sweet.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. So back to the question of dipping vegetables. Right? No, I didn't write this, right? Right? The Gemara says where there are other vegetables available besides bitter herbs, right? So the first time you use the other vegetable and you say Borei Pri Adama, which is what we do, right? With the parsley or the potato or whatever, we dip it and we say Borei Pri Adama and we eat it. And later on, we dip the maror and we say al achilat maror and we eat that, right? But if you only have lettuce, what do? And Rav Huna said, you say Borei Pri Adama over the lettuce and eat it. And then after the matzah, you say Borei al achilat maror and eat the lettuce. Okay, so you say two blessings over the one vegetable. Okay, so Rav Chisda says, wait, no, you ate the lettuce. Now you're going to say another blessing. Rav Chisda says, no, you say two blessings the first time you eat lettuce. You just eat the lettuce one time, but you say Borei Pri Adama and al achilat maror, and you eat it, and then the second time you eat the lettuce without a blessing, because you've already said a blessing over the lettuce. Okay. I'm going to zip through this a little bit because I do want to get to one more thing. All right. So in Syria, they act in accordance with the opinion of Rav Huna, and Rav Sheshet, son of Rav Yoshua, acted in accordance with the opinion of Rav Chisda, and the halacha is in accordance with the opinion of Rav Chisda. All right, I'm going to skip ahead a little bit. Okay, to the next one. Ravina said, Rav Maharshia, son of Rav Natan, said to me that Hillel said as follows, citing tradition, a person should not wrap matzah and bitter herbs together and eat them. Because today, after the destruction of the temple, the obligation to eat matzah applies by Torah law, and the obligation to eat bitter herbs without the Paschal lamb applies by rabbinic law. Okay, and if one were to wrap them together, the bitter herbs, whose obligation applies by rabbinic law, would come and nullify the matzah, whose obligation applies by Torah law. I'm not sure I understand this nullification bit, okay? But I mean, there are two things that are worth pointing out. The first is that Hillel is saying, right? In other words, matzah is in and of itself a mitzvah, right? There's a mitzvah to eat matzah, right? Because it says many times, right? You 7 days you shall eat matzah, right?
Also,
7 days you shall eat matzah.
but there's also a place where it says only required on the first night. That's very confusing.
Right. It's right. But nevertheless, it's required on the first night.
Right.
That's the point. It's required on the first night. That is an independent biblical mitzvah that is not reliant upon the Paschal lamb.
Right.
But the only place where it says to eat bitter herbs, it says you shall slaughter and roast the Paschal lamb and eat it with bitter herbs and matzah. There is no place else where it independently says eat bitter herbs. The mitzvah to eat bitter herbs is to accompany the Paschal lamb with bitter herbs.
Well then, we shouldn't be eating the bitter herbs because we can't eat the Paschal lamb.
Right. But so Hillel is saying it's a rabbinic mitzvah and not a biblical mitzvah. It's a rabbinic mitzvah and not a biblical mitzvah anymore because you can't fulfill the biblical mitzvah. It's impossible to fulfill the biblical mitzvah, right? But you could still have bitter herbs. You just can't have it with the Paschal lamb, and the biblical mitzvah is to have it with the Paschal lamb. Now, the other thing is wrap matzah and bitter herbs together. Have any of you tried to wrap matzah and bitter herbs together?
Wrap matzah with anything.
Yeah, but they say that romaine lettuce can be used as bitter herbs because it's bitter. So
Correct.
you could wrap a piece of matzah with a piece of lettuce of
And you can
romaine
wrap
lettuce.
You tell me how you're going to
No, you
wrap
can
a
wrap the
piece of
lettuce around
matzah
the-
around a piece
You
of
can wrap
lettuce.
the lettuce around the
You
matzah. can't
wrap the lettuce
matzah.
around the matzah.
Right, right.
But that's not what he says. He's saying
Right.
wrap the matzah around the lettuce.
But aren't you the one that always says to me, do you take things too literally?
No, but here Hillel is taking it literally. I mean, here's the deal. The cracker type matzah that we have is not what they had.
Uh-huh.
Okay. The matzah that they had was more like a wrap or a lafa, if you know what a lafa is.
Yeah. But,
Okay,
but then why is shmura matzah, which is the furthest thing from falafel, not falafel, but
From lafa.
yeah. But that's the furthest thing you can possibly imagine, even further from regular matzah. But they didn't have shmura matzah either then, right?
Well, no, but no, they didn't. Well, I mean, all of their matzah was shmura matzah because that simply
Sure.
means that it was made by hand
Right.
from wheat that had been watched to make sure that it didn't come into contact with water. But the cracker, like, I mean, that was really, it was because the lafa type matzah goes bad quickly.
Yeah. Like bread.
Like bread. And so therefore, you had to bake matzah every day, which originally people did. But then, I mean, as society, right? I mean, look, in the ancient world, I mean, I say bring the fish to a shochet. You didn't bring anything to a shochet.
Right.
You learned how to shecht, and you shechted, right? You didn't go to Modi's market and buy matzah. You made your own matzah,
Well,
right?
but how far back are you talking? Because
I'm talking you know,
Biblical times.
biblical times.
Yeah, because Toby's father was a shochet and they did bring,
Right.
yeah, okay.
But the thing is that the matzah that they ate
It's not what we,
was, so when what Hillel actually did, now we're not going to have time because we actually do, I mean, we don't wrap, but we eat together precisely what the Gemara here is telling us Hillel said we shouldn't do. Right? But then there's another, later, you go further, say, well, I'm not sure that that's authentic. I think Hillel did say to do that. Right? But the point is that I mean, Hillel lived when the temple stood. So he would take a piece of that soft matzah and he would make, like a shawarma, right? He would take some paschal lamb and some bitter herbs and wrap it together, because you could wrap it together because it was soft, like a laffa. All right. It's late. I'm really tired.
Can you send us the link to Pesachim?
Yeah, I sent it out this morning.
Okay, good.
Yeah. All right.
Thank
Good
you
night.
so much.
Thank you.
Pleasure.
Good night.
Thanks for joining.
Yashikar.
See ya. Good night.